Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Journey to SEA 2025. I am Shellyan Edwards Barron, your host and creative writing specialist, here to talk to you about all things reports, narratives, and comprehension. So, thank you for those of you who are able to join the live. I really do appreciate not feeling like if I'm speaking just to, nobody in particular. It helps when I have people on the live who are engaged and asking questions. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to join me live. And for those of you who are looking at the recording, thank you so much for your time. I also appreciate all the comments and questions that I get. And let me put that up early. So for those of you who would love to ask questions and so on, please feel free. You can WhatsApp me at 7174993, and I will be able to take the questions. Probably not during the live. At this point, I'm working out a system where I would be able to see the questions come up, but certainly send me questions at 7174993, and I can answer the questions as well. And you can send me messages on Facebook. You can find me at Shelly Ann Edwards Barron on Facebook, and you can look at my Facebook page, which is Wood Coach Youth on Facebook as well. So you can send me questions there. I'm more than happy to answer your questions once they're related to reports, narratives, comprehension, general SEA type things. I usually stay away from the math, but of course, with the worded problems, I have some guidance on the worded problems so that I'll be able to share that with you as well later on in this series. We are at episode 3. It's exciting, isn't it? We're heading to SEA 2025. Imagine that. Just a couple weeks ago, couple of months ago, we were at SEA 2024, and now we are going on to 2025. So, for those of you who are new to this series, this is episode 3, as I said, and the first two episodes focused on getting started, how to arrange yourself, organize yourself for the entire journey, and I gave you an idea of what I would be covering. Plus, we looked at the definitions and understanding of the reports and narratives, plus a look at the different types of comprehension texts. So if you haven't seen those first two episodes, my recommendation is to pause this one, go back and look at those two, because those two are the foundation. And you really want to get the foundation before you get into the details, which is something that I'll be discussing in this episode, where when we get into the report writing and the narrative writing, sometimes we skip details because we think that, okay, we're starting at the beginning. But what really is the beginning? In my opinion, the beginning is with the skills. And when you get to the complete writing of narratives and writing of complete reports, at that point, students should have already been exposed to certain skills. And so while we are looking at getting started and we're just our third episode in, we're not starting at the beginning that most people think the beginning would be. So let's get into it. And oh, maybe I should tell you just a quick note about myself if this is your first episode. I am a creative writing specialist and I work with writers at varying levels. My aim is to make writing as easily accessible as possible to all my clients and students and customers. And so I do editing as well for authors who are working on books, in addition to the creative writing and comprehension that I do with the primary school students. All right. So that's just a quick background on me. If you want the more details, you can go back to episode 1. But now we're getting into, let's see, we are getting into report writing. Yeah. So I usually like to do the report writing first because report writing is very structured and organized, much more so for readers and writers to really follow step by step very strict rules and guidelines. And so we begin with the reports. because of that format. And today's episode, we're actually talking about the 5 paragraph structure. Now, with the report writing, and in fact with narratives as well, SEA does not actually specify how many paragraphs. So if you have that question, how many paragraphs should a student be writing at the SEA level for reports? The answer is it depends on the student. Now, reports are supposed to have beginning, middle, end, just as narratives. And so if you go 1 paragraph for the beginning, 1 paragraph for the middle, 1 paragraph for the end, you're looking at a minimum of 3 paragraphs. But there is no maximum limit. That really only depends on how much the student can write and how fluent the student is at writing. If you have a student who is not fluent at all and they're sincerely struggling, I would recommend, try to fit it within the 3 paragraphs. However, what I've noticed is that sometimes it's a little bit more challenging when students use like 3 or 4 paragraphs for them to really include all the necessary details. And so this is why I recommend, in general, for students who are moderate writers to fluent writers and efficient writers, I still recommend 5 paragraphs. Now, I know some students can write more than that, and I've had students tell me, Miss, I write 6 paragraphs, Miss, I write 7 paragraphs. But what happens when they do that is that one, they stretch the information. And remember, part of the report structure that we looked at in previous episodes is that a report is supposed to be concise and precise. And so you really want to condition yourself as a writer of reports to keep it as short as possible while still giving relevant details. And the types of reports that students have to work with for SEA, I think 5 robust paragraphs are enough for them to give sufficient details and still get the length that they need to give enough information. So stretching it to 6 and 7 paragraphs might happen in some cases, but then we might end up running into situations where the information is dragged out or it's drawn out or it feels like some extra details are included. So to minimize that, I really do recommend working with that 5 paragraph structure. And I think that it can actually be used for students who are not so clear on reports and might be a little bit struggling, because then they can say, okay, after I do this, I move on to the next paragraph. So they have more of a guideline and more of an understanding of what goes into the paragraph. And once they write, let's say maybe 2 or 3 sentences, I would recommend 3 sentences. Once they write at least 3 sentences in a paragraph, it counts, especially if they're working with the more complex sentences where they use certain types of transition words, which we will be covering. So even a weak student should be able to learn off 1 or 2 transition words and phrases that they can include in their writing. And so using the 5 paragraph structure, I think works best all around, even for students who are struggling. Of course, you know the student, and there are some students who are struggling to such an extent that maybe 3 paragraphs could work. But I would say see how maybe the 5 paragraphs can function, and then you can take it from there. But at least with the 5 paragraph structure, we're going with a certain organizational plan for the report. Now, before we get into that, just a quick reminder of the types of reports. Last week we looked at them briefly, but I just wanted to, type it up, show you these are the types that we're working with, and put a little word of caution. Now, when I studied the report exams, and we had reports this year. The last time we had reports before that, I think, was 2021, and then in 2019 we had reports. Was 22. In 22, we had reports, and then in 2019, reports. So we have three past papers that we can study to see how the exams are set for reports. And when I studied those, what I noticed is that in none of them did we get a natural disaster report. So I include natural disasters in my booklet, there's the five reports challenge booklets. If you want to get samples of reports and prompts that you could work with and so on to really get into it, those booklets are available. It's 135 for this set, and there are, I think, like about 12 different booklets, where you get vocabulary and different things as well. But I include natural disasters on the list because it's something that it's useful for students to understand how to share information about that as well. However, like I said, in none of the three sample past papers that we have are natural disasters represented. What we do have represented are incident and accident reports, mainly leaning on the accident side. We have activities and we have events. I also did not see competition reports, but again, like I said, it's included because it's a good idea for students to be able to understand how to respond and how to give information on competitions as well. But if we're going strictly based on the track record that we have with those three past papers, then we're looking at incidents, accidents, activities, and events, and they are all surrounded on school sessions, school location, and what students would encounter in a school day, either at the beginning, at the end, or during the school day. So that's one thing I wanted to really point out as we move forward with these. So while I will be including some information on competition and one or two details on natural disasters, remember that we're checking with the past papers to really decide how and what we put our attention on, because there's so much to cover. We want to make sure we fulfill what the exam is likely to be like, and we use the past papers to give us that kind of idea. So then let's look at the structure itself. Now, when I work with my students, and certainly in the textbook, so if you, again, if you're looking for more information on this and you're not enrolled in any of my classes, I have a textbook on reports that you can go through. There's practice, details, follow-on work that would help students, really understand the report writing and structure. So you can WhatsApp me or send me a message on Facebook if your student is struggling with reports. Um, I think it would really help because it goes into a lot more detail than I can go into in these sessions, and you can follow along because what I'd be covering in these sessions, you'd get a lot more practice and details in the text. So let's look at the five paragraph structure that I mentioned before for reports. So paragraph one, I call it a summary. Everybody else and most people call it an introduction, but I'll explain what I mean by summary in a minute. So after the summary, we go into before, during, after, and then outcomes. So here's what I mean by that. Now, a report really is the relaying of observations and what students witnessed or participated in for a situation. And every situation, every experience has a beginning, middle, and end. And that's the main section of the report. So paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, those are the main sections of the report that include the beginning, when things started and what that looked like. The during was the main focus of the situation, and we want step-by-step details. And then after, which would be like immediate reactions. And so that's the middle of the report that we call the body of the report. The introduction then serves as a summary of the main points. And most students will be taught that the introduction includes the answers to who, what, where, and when. So when we talk about when, we want the day, we want the date, we want the year and month, that kind of thing. And we actually want the time for certain types of reports, especially like the incidents and accidents. You need a specific time because an incident would happen at a specific time. An event, on the other hand, would not happen at one particular time. It'll happen over duration. So, like maybe from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m., whereas an incident, if somebody fell and got injured, they're not going to fall from 3 p.m. to 3:30. There'll be one point they would fall at 3 p.m. or approximately, and then other things would happen after, and other things would have happened before. So that's why I really wanted to stress that last week, and continuing, make sure students understand the different types of reports and what would be required for the different types of reports. So here's the thing with the 5 paragraph structure. An incident and accident report follow the same follows the same kind of those two follow the same kind of structure, where there's one thing happening at a particular time. Events and activities and competitions usually take place over duration, and so the content and how you format your introduction is going to be slightly different when it comes to the time and certain other details. Because when we talk about what, that would be the main thing that the report is about. So, what could be: a student was injured in the cafeteria, or at the particular school, or it could be a student got lost, or there was a field trip, or there was an event, and so that will be the what. So depending on the type of report, the what is going to be phrased slightly differently. And also we're looking at where. My recommendation for answering that question, where, comes in two parts. We have a general location. So is it at school? Is it at a stadium? Is it at a venue that will be named? Or, let's say we're going to a field trip to the zoo. Those are general locations. Then we want a specific location. Whereas, like if we have an incident, somebody fell, they fell at school and was injured, but where exactly did that happen? Cafeteria, classroom, student lounge, front courtyard, play field. We want specific information as well, and that's going to be formatted in a particular way. And then and then who. So we have what, where, and when, and then we have who. Answering that question would be who was involved. Now, the recommendation that I give for who was involved on writing that introduction includes the participants, and both participants, if there was an injury and somebody contributed to the injury, so maybe one child was pushed or something like that, um, then you're looking at two different people. I also recommend students include the teacher who attended to the situation, or the main person dealing with the situation. And here's why. Remember last week when we spoke about the fact that reports are written to a specific person? Most times when a report is requested, and for many of the past papers, if you check them, as we said, you would see write a report to your principal, write a report to your teacher. Especially when reports are written to principals, one of the things a principal always wants to know is, what did the teacher do? Because remember, the principal is responsible for everything, and then they delegate authority to teachers to handle certain things in their absence. Of course, they can't be present everywhere, so teachers have responsibilities. And one of the main things would be, if I wasn't there, my teachers know that this is the protocol. Did the teacher follow the protocol? That is something a principal is going to be interested in. And so while students must understand that they're writing to either teacher or principal, in doing that, they must understand what kind of details that person would require. And so, because a principal is going to be interested in what teachers do, then I always include the main person, the main teacher, or the main adult who participated in whatever the situation is. And so those are the things that I would include in the summary that, most people are given information on. Before would be what happens right before. So we have the main situation, and then that's something that students need to be able to identify. What is the main situation? Then we decide what happened before. So what were like the few minutes leading up to this thing? If it's a competition, we might want the, let's say, opening ceremonies. If it's an event, maybe opening ceremonies, activity, rules and guidelines, those kinds of things. So, parameters, this is what you're supposed to do, information on what the activity is, why we're doing it, that type of thing. So again, you see why it's important for students to know what type of the report they're responding to, because not all the introductions are going to be the same kind of information, but the details would be written up slightly different, and students need to practice this. What happened before? Again, we want to know a few minutes before the actual main situation, but depending on the type of report, it's going to be written up differently. During would be the middle situation. What is the main focus of the report? And we want that step by step. But again, if it's an incident or accident versus an activity or event, details themselves are going to be slightly different. And then immediately after means how do people respond? So if it's an incident or accident, how do the students respond? Somebody's going to run to call a teacher. Somebody might, prefect might step up and say something. When the teacher arrives, what does the teacher do? That's what happens immediately after. And then outcomes and consequences, that has to do with what's the result, right? What's the overall result? And while we're giving overall result, we do want to try to stick within the same day. So if a student was injured and they had to, be taken to the hospital or something, maybe the teacher would reprimand the class and say, hey, don't do this next time. So those kinds of things we want to list as outcomes. And so that's how the report would be structured. But again, and I keep repeating this because I believe it's extremely important, understanding the different type of report you're working with will give students a better idea of what kind of details to include even within the um, five paragraph structure, right? And so for this week, as we do every week, we're looking at what we do, how we study, and how we progress with this. This week, we're focusing on understanding what goes into each of the different paragraphs. So you want to maybe start with a prompt, have the student decide what type of report it is, because remember, we're continuing this practice. And then we want to look at, okay, what goes into paragraph one? What kind of details would you put? What goes into paragraph two? And you're really just discussing. You're sharing information, exploring different types of events, and looking at, what is the beginning, middle, end of this? What's the main part of this? And we're really just having discussions and having students identify, maybe come up with their own ideas and so on, and that's what you're focusing on this week. If you need some help with that and you're not too sure, okay, where do I get prompts? Where do I get an example of some of these things? Then you can check I have a creative writing sample booklet that has 3 sample reports and 3 sample narratives. And so you could look at those. It's just $50 for that. Um, so that's, I think, is worth it just to have those 3 samples that you could go through as you're practicing. If you want more detailed input and like step by step, There's a 5 paragraph structure that I work with in the 5 reports challenge. Let me write that up. The 5 reports challenge is 135. And so if you want more, step by step guidelines kind of thing, send me a message on WhatsApp or on Facebook. You could even comment on this in YouTube and we could make contact so that you can get a copy. It's digital, it's not printed. So once payment is cleared, I email it, you get instant access to it. You don't have to print all of it, just the pieces that you need for practice if you print anything at all. So it's really pretty cost effective because of all the information that you get. And so for this week, if you already have the booklets, what you're doing is you're looking at, there's a section in each of the booklets that gives a breakdown, paragraph by paragraph breakdown for each of the different types of reports. And that is what you're studying, coming up with your own situations, your own scenarios, and so on. Um, you can choose, there's a list of at least 3 prompts in each of the booklets so that you can get sample prompts to work with. What type of report is this, and so on. If you're still working with having students identify the types of reports, then the textbook comes with a workbook that creates, that you have worksheets where you can have, students identifying types of reports. And I call it investigating facts. That one for the set is 395, I believe. See, yeah, I think it's 395, but you get 3 books for that. Textbook, like what, maybe 160 so pages. Workbook, about 90 so pages, and then a journal to help students keep practicing. Because remember, consistency and practice is the key, and repetition to help students really continue with working on that. And that's the Investigating Facts series, 3 books in all. All right. And so that is for the report writing. And just to recap, this week, what you're working on, making sure students recognize that in terms of organizing their ideas for a report, they need to have a summary at the beginning, because that summary says the main ideas, which is what happened, where, to whom, and who was involved, etc. Then we want before, mean, after, and then consequences. So you want them to understand that those sections, and you're working with the idea of, that step by step. And of course, if you need additional support with that, the booklets that I have go into detail with that so you can get all of the information there. So that's our wrap up for reports. So we have 2 30-minute sessions a week, and then we could work with a third one, maybe 30 minutes or more, where you do some revision kind of review testing kind of thing. So you can do the practice discussion and then have the student do some, a little, I guess, review test on their own, and the worksheets and so on would help with that. And of course, with the textbook experiments, each concept comes with an activity or an experiment. So you have time to do that during the week once you're working on it, to make the report writing feel a little bit more fun and not just, something tedious and boring. And so I think that is it for report writing, and that's, what you're covering exactly this week. And so now let us shift our attention to narrative writing. Now, with narrative writing, at this point, we understand what a narrative is. We know that it's flash fiction. We know that it's very, very short. And we know that we need some kind of structure for the narrative. Now, the issue that I've been seeing, and I've noticed it both with reports and narrative, but it creates a bigger problem with narratives, is that when many teachers start teaching narratives, they start with the introduction, right? So they know students have done similes and metaphors, and they've done some figurative writing, otherwise, descriptive writing, otherwise, in maybe standards 2 and 3, and they have that foundation. when they get to standard 4 and they're putting things together, students are asked to write an introduction. So they're given a plot. Sorry, they're given a prompt because sometimes they're not given plot. They're given a prompt and they're asked to write an introduction. The challenge with that is what's included in an introduction. And we're going to spend some time looking specifically at introductions and how to write them later on. But for now, let me just give a brief overview. What happens in an introduction is that we need to introduce the character, we need to give background information, and we need to look at what the character wants. So, what is the foundation of the story? Right? And in some introductions, we also can introduce the first problem if we want to start early and really spend the main part of it dealing with other problems to create the rising action and so on. So we find that when we deal with the introduction by itself, we don't have a lot of details. So we don't know what are the ideas in the story. We don't know what's the conflict and what's the problem unless we've really analyzed the prompt. And we don't know what the lesson is and where the story is really heading. And so it's really challenging to create an introduction for a flash fiction, a really short story, if you don't have all of these details. Because what makes a really short story very effective is when, let's say, the ending of the story, the character is learning something like always be kind to others. That's going to make a lot more sense if at the beginning of the story, the character was being mean and unkind. And then, based on their lack of kindness, they went through some situations and then they learn a lesson. You know what? I shouldn't have done that. I should have been kind from the beginning. But if you don't know what that lesson is, and the student hasn't even thought about anything like that, then it's going to be very hard to make the introduction and the conclusion of the story connect. And in a flash fiction, a really short story, that is what makes the story really feel satisfying to readers when the beginning and the ending connect. And so we really do need to consider not teaching the introduction before we teach plot. I recommend starting with plot and learning how to get students to understand plot. And so the plot shows the connection between ideas. You must have a conflict for rising action in the plot, and there must be a lesson learned. So I'm going to pause this share to check on something here. I wanted to show you a diagram of what the plot looks like. I know a lot of teachers talk about the plot mountain, and that's something that students should recognize because it really shows the development beginning to end. And I also want to show you what I call the 12-point plot development. I'm just going to show you that briefly as well, because that is something that, again, we are going to go through some of the details in the plot, but the idea is that I really can't cover everything in the short space of time that we have here. So that if you really want to go through and understand the details of the plot, then it's something that you might need to really go into more and more, and I could share a resource with you on that. So let me show you the plot, what it is for most. When most teachers present plot, they deal with the large, I guess we can call that brown, large brown numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have the introduction, which is sometimes called the exposition. Then we have the rising action, then we have climax, then we have falling action, and conclusion, which is also sometimes called the resolution. But as you can see with the colored numbers represent the 12-point plot. What happens is that with the 12-point plot, what I'm showing is exactly how to achieve the rising action. Many students don't understand how to get rising action. And when rising action is thought of as like one thing, they often believe that they only have like one problem in the story, one conflict. And when they're taught as one block, they give the one problem, but that's not enough to give real rising action to build the tension. In order to build tension and to create effective rising action, you need the conflict to increase. You need the problem to get worse. So it's not just about, okay, um, the person gets lost and they cry for a bit and then they find their way out. They get lost, they cry, then maybe they start to hear noises and they get afraid because something is coming to attack them. And then they have to run from this thing. And in running from this thing, they get cornered. That's how you build tension. It's not just about one situation given in details, regardless of how many details you give. It's not really about that one situation and then you solve the problem right away. And in addition to that, how does the problem get solved? We talk about climax, which is number 3 in the general scheme of things, but point number 10 in the 12 point. How do we get there? We don't just jump from problem to solution. Something has to happen, and I call it an intervention. If you look at any of the stories that you found really interesting and exciting, you would see that there's a reason. So, just as there's a cause of the problem, there's also a reason for the solution. And the climax is the solution. So, what I want you to really pay attention to this week is understanding that plot has a lot to do with making sure students understand the gist of the story, the general idea of the story. And so don't go and start with the introduction, who the character is, where they are, and deal with setting and all of those things. Don't start writing introduction paragraphs until students really understand what is the function of an introduction and how it relates to the rest of the story. And that is something that you really do need to pay attention to. So, for the agenda this week, for the narrative writing, you're doing a couple of things. One, you are making sure students understand what plot is and understanding the different sections of the plot. Because really and truly, let me go back to that other diagram, well, the notes that we're working with. Um, the plot shows the connection between the events, and plot also must have conflict to have that rising action, and the lesson learned, there must be a moral to the story, right? And so all of those things have to work together in a plot. So for this week, you're introducing the concept of plot in a story. And I use the word plot and not plan because there's a difference. All right. A plan tells you step by step what happened. A plot tells you what happened and how those events are connected. So in a report, you don't need to know the connection, you're just observing and you're stating what's observed. In a narrative, on the other hand, readers want to know why. What's the cause of this? And what did this result in? And how do people feel about these things and so on? And that's what a plot shows. And so that's why we talk about plotting a narrative and planning a report. It also helps students to keep them separate in their minds when we use different terminology too. So we talk about reports, facts, etc., and we're planning that. We talk about narratives, giving feelings and experiences, and we're plotting that. So students could see that, yeah, these are really two different kinds of writing. And so we want to look at the different aspects of the plot. You want to help students understand that there must be conflict. What is conflict? Um, it's a problem for the main character. And so we might want to brainstorm, give them situations where they would see, well, okay, this is the situation. So what are the problems here? What could be possible problems? And you can look at sample stories and say, okay, what do they look like? How is the plot shown in this sample story? And so they can practice, identifying it just so that they can recognize what are the different sections, right? And so with the narrative, this week we're really just introducing it and understanding it. And if you want an exciting way to do that, I have something called, well, it's a series. I call it, I guess, it's a package, 12-point plot package, and I believe that one is 245. What you get in that is the I wonder if I have it. Yeah, I think I have. You get flashcards that tell you for the different types of, well, you get the diagram of the plot. You know what? Let me stop share so I can show you properly. Right? You get the diagram of the plot. You get a blank one so that when you're practicing and giving details, you get a card that identifies each part of the diagram and a definition. I know students work really well with flashcards, especially with these kinds of things where they could learn off, right? And so you get context with definition. You get an activity. Well, you get two activities. Um, you get an activity card. This is activity one. You get activity two, right? So you get two activities plus the flashcards. You get a poster. I don't think I have a poster here though, but you get the flashcards, a poster, some videos explaining the activities and what each section of the plot would be. And you get well, unlimited access to that. So flashcard, poster, videos to cover the information so you're not lost. And then you get some practice materials besides some worksheets. So you get a 12-point plot worksheet that you could give students prompt and have them plot out the worksheet. And you get diagrams and different things. So if you are following this series, definitely for the next, I would say 3 sessions, we're going to be looking at plot because plot is that important. Understanding the different aspects of it, it is that important. It's so important that even though I haven't completed my text on narrative writing, I've completed the plot information because if you have that and you're following the series, this Journey to SEA 2025, you would have a lot of the details that you need and you can practice, and that works perfectly fine. For students who are more advanced and they already understand plot, although to be clear, when we get to climax, because I'm going to spend like an entire session for narratives on climax alone because of how misunderstood climax is. Take it from me, you really want to get that foundation with the narratives because climax is completely misunderstood. So just to give you a hint, many people believe that climax is when you first encounter the biggest problem in the story, or that climax is the biggest problem of the story. Climax is not the biggest problem. Climax is how you solve the problem. Climax is a turning point in the story, and to get a turning point, things have to change. And things don't change if you just encounter the problem. Things only change when you're solving the problem and when the problem is finished and you're good. And now things are different from all the tension. So the tension is kind of being released. And so that is what climax is. So when students misunderstand climax, their entire plot is off and they really don't end their stories effectively. Some students naturally understand once they read samples and so on, but some students need this step by step guideline to really make them understand how to write an effective story following the effective guideline. So you can message me. The information is up also in SEA Peacefield Approach. We're no longer able to stream the lives there, but the lives are on YouTube and the Facebook page, and the information will be there. But you can check in to get a copy of this package with the plot. Take what I'm telling you. Understanding plot is that important. And once you have access to that, you always have access to me with my number. And remember, we're WhatsApping 868-717-4993 for information, so that you can ask me questions as well. It's not just, okay, if you want to get a package or something, if you have a burning question about reports or narratives and you didn't get the answer in a live, or you don't see the answers anywhere, you're getting conflicting information, message me. I'll answer the question. Can't promise same day, but I will answer the question. If not, in a WhatsApp message to you directly. In addition to that, I will also address the concern during a live. So you could message me and let me know if you have any comments or questions about narratives, reports, or comprehension, and I'll do my best to share the information with you. So, all right, what are we doing this week for narratives? Just a recap: introducing plot, and at the very least, you want to make sure students know that there's conflict in plot, what conflict is, and you want them to know there has to be a lesson, has to be some kind of moral to the story. Why was I in this experience? What did I learn from it? And that type of thing. And you want them to recognize that rising action has steps. It's not just one thing and that's it. Right, so that is your agenda this week for the narratives. Now let's move on to comprehension. And so this week for comprehension, I'm going to make a case for reading the questions first, and I want to share some resources with you for the different types of questions. And I did in the past, I did some let's see. Yeah, I did a few articles on that. And so I'm going to share. I haven't updated the blog per se just yet, but I'm going to share in the chat. And these, of course, would show up in YouTube. I'm going to share these links for articles that I wrote on the different types of questions that students can encounter in general, because we are going to be going through specifically for the different types of texts, specific questions that you'd have more on this, more on that. But these are like general types of questions that you could look at. So we know about the literal and the inferential. So literal would be stuff that's right there. Inferential, or the ones that you have to interpret, means you're getting your making inferences, drawing conclusions. We have applied, which would be taking you beyond the text. How do you think? What do you feel? What would you have done if you were in this situation? Those types of things. Um, and then, of course, we have the vocabulary questions. We call them lexical. Um, you know, they look at like details and vocabulary as well, meanings of words and so on. And so we have those, and then we have other types. I mean, different researchers use different terms to talk about questions. So in one of the articles, I referred to a certain type, and in another of the articles, I referred to different types so that you could really understand the details. So when we talk about, for example, there's this approach to comprehension called question answer relationship. right? So if you want, you could probably, I'm going to put it up because you can probably Google that to get more information if all of this is completely new to you and you want to have some details on how to deal with that. Question answer relationship. And so we talk about questions that are answers are in the passage, they're right there. Answers are in the reader's head, which are the author and me. We talk about on your own type questions and so on. So, what's the relationship between the questions and the answers? How do I get the answers? And so different approaches work for different students. And so that's why I've provided both. But in this, so you can read those articles and get more information about the different types of questions. But I want to advocate reading the question first and questions. And depending on the student, you could probably read like all the questions first, or you can just go question by question. But here's my reasoning. And I kind of hinted at it last session, but I want to explain it in a little bit more this session. The issue with a comprehension test or comprehension exam is that the questions being asked are not going to be all the questions that could possibly be asked about a passage. So let's say you have a poem and you have 7 or 8 questions, even 10 questions on the poem. Anybody who is a teacher or examiner could come up and look at those 10 questions and probably give you another 10 questions. So it depends on the perspective taken. So reading the poem first or reading the passage first, whatever comprehension text it is, reading that first is not really preparing you to answer the questions that are being asked. It's giving you a lot of information that you could work with, but it's not preparing you to answer the questions that are being asked. The questions that are being asked are particular types of questions, and the only way to be prepared for those questions is to read those questions, and then you know what to look for in the passage or in the poem. So it makes little sense to me, and I'm trying to be careful how I say that because I know a lot of students are being taught, okay, read the passage first so that you could understand the passage and then answer the questions. But that's for when you're reading for understanding, and that's for when you are reading for details or for discussion or reading for pleasure. When you're reading for an exam and there are questions, you really want to maximize your time and maximize your effort and therefore go directly to the questions, right? And so, what I want to talk about now is when you're going to the questions, the different kinds of questions. So, read the questions first because that is going to be the best use of time in an exam. And when you read the questions first, you know exactly the kind of targeted area that you are going for, right? And then you can get to the questions. And so once you have that in mind and you know that, okay, read the questions first and then answer the questions, when you're finished with that, you could go back and read the passage to make sure when you're double checking your answers, if you have that kind of time, then that's perfectly fine. But you want to read the questions first. And so once you read the questions first, you would recognize that we have the different types of questions as I had mentioned just now. So I'm going to share with you the ones just, so that you could see it, have it up on screen so that you could see the different types of questions. And these are like general questions, not the specific ones. right? These are the general questions that you can encounter. If you want to place the types of questions in categories, we can deal with what we call lexical questions. And those lexical questions have to do with the details and vocabulary and so on. We put those into one group. Then we have the literal questions where we're looking at um, understanding, general understanding of what the passage is saying. Then we have the interpretation where we're looking at a more comprehensive understanding, where we have details given and students have to form their own conclusion based on those details given. And then we have applied questions where students are given details, and then based on those details, they have to come to their own understanding of what they would do in that kind of situation. So they are applying their own knowledge to these kinds of questions. And so questions like creating a title, or, what would you do in this situation? How do you feel about a particular character? Those kinds of questions. Um, I am what's the, those, yeah, those will go under applied. Interpretation questions would be like, main idea. How does this character feel about that one? Those types of things. Literal questions are, what time of day was the concert? And when you go to the passage, you would see the concert began at 8 p.m. So you're getting the exact details in the passage. And so we have these general groups of questions. And when we get to looking in a little bit more detail at the different types of comprehension passages, and we are going to look at those bit, because if you missed last week's episode, go back and check it. We're talking about, we have four different kinds of texts that students will be exposed to. Um, in general, with past papers and practice tests and everything. In the exam, they have three: a passage, a poem, and a graphic. But for the passage, it could either be fiction or nonfiction. And so, in general, over all the different types of texts, you have these four categories of questions. But then, when you study each type of text, you realize that a different, let's say for a graphic, you would have different types of questions related to, like, one of the questions, as I was going through the 2024, one of the questions was, and in 2023 as well, why is this word in big bold letters? You're not going to get that in a poem or fiction or a nonfiction comprehension text. You only get that question in graphics. And so we're going to look at what each type is, what types of questions are unique to each type, in addition to these general ideas. So this week, what you're doing for comprehension is getting students into the habit of reading the questions first, making sure that they understand that comprehension questions are very specific and they're not asking you everything. So you don't need to understand the entire passage word for word inside out before you start answering questions. Read the questions first. And then you want to go on to analyzing questions. What kind of question is this? What is this question really asking for? Can you find it in the passage? Do you have to form conclusions? Do you have to apply your own knowledge and come up with your own answer based on what's in the passage? What kind of question is this? And so that's what you're practicing this week, getting students to understand the kinds of questions that they would be exposed to. And so while I have some information on this, my comprehension textbook isn't yet complete. So I'm starting with poetry because I think that's the area that gives most challenges. But you have the articles where you can get some general guidelines on the different kinds of questions. And I'm sure you have textbooks with comprehension passages and questions, and so you can do that assessment with the different kinds of questions. What kind of question is this? You're not necessarily looking to get an answer just yet, but you're really paying attention to what kind of question because you want students to be prepared. If this is an applied question, then I'm not going to find the answer in the passage, so I shouldn't waste my time searching the passage for the answer. What I will search the passage for would be details to support my point of view, which is different from trying to get a word or phrase or even a complete sentence directly from the passage to put in my answer, which is what literal questions you can do that. And, what's the difference between applied and inferential? That's what you want to make sure students understand this week to really give them that solid foundation with comprehension. And so I don't need to go through all of those in detail because I put the links in the chat and in the comments for you to get the articles. The information is there. If you read it and still have questions or you're getting some challenges with your particular student, then message me and let me know. And we'll see how best I can answer you and give you information about that. So I think we're at the end. So you have your agenda for this week. You have your study items for this week. So for reports, we're looking at that 5 paragraph structure. For narratives, we're understanding plot. And for comprehension, we're looking at the different types of questions in a little bit more detail. And we're making sure students recognize, read the questions first. All right. So thank you so very, very much for taking in the whole hour, and we're heading up to an hour and 2 minutes, for asking questions, for those of you who asked questions, and for those of you who contact me outside of the session, please keep doing this. I appreciate all the questions and comments greatly. If you have a comment, something you want to see that you didn't see, or something that I'm covering that you'd prefer I don't cover, let me know. Feedback is welcome. All types of feedback would be welcome. So, thanks again for tuning in. And next week, we're going into starting with one of the texts with the comprehension. We're looking at the plot again, and we're going to start with a little bit more details with the 5 paragraph structure for the report. So stay tuned, check in every Tuesday, 11 a.m. ish. I try to start at 11 exactly, but sometimes, a few minutes after. But every Tuesday, I'll be here. If I'm going to miss one, I'll let you know. So, keep in touch. All right. Take care, everybody. Have an awesome week.